might as well see that. Want to close off my back. Well, I want to see my head with the sun in my eyes.
I want to welcome our audience and, of course, all the council members and the members of the planning department and the administration and zoning and the mayor's assistant to this study session. And I want to make sure everybody knows this is a study session in which council is going to hear from Kathy Rosdick and others about a number of questions. The agenda is talking about 3 different things: an update on the current rental inspection program and possible revisions, recap of the ordinance that was considered but not passed last year, and an introduction of the concept of a vacant property fee to address blight. That might seem like it's far removed from short-term rentals, but we are really trying to do a holistic look at property maintenance in the city of Erie. We will, when this moves to be proposed as an ordinance, there will be a public hearing, and at that time, the many people who have ideas they would like to share will be able to comment on the proposed ordinance. One of the things I think it's really important to know is that with anything, we need to, in my opinion, kind of look at the kind of rhetoric that's being used about this particular issue. This can be a civil discussion. We've been talking about this, believe it or not, since 2017. I was not on council in 2017, but that's when there was a zoning hearing board ruling that allowed a short-term rental to exist in Glenwood. And at that time, the zoning hearing board chair, and keep in mind, zoning hearing board is a volunteer position. Zoning hearing board members put in a lot of time being trained and making decisions. She said, I hope that council and planning will get together and work on a plan. And here we are 4.5 years later, and we're still doing this. But I want to assure you that Erie isn't the only place that is wrestling with this. Every day I could pick up something and see that different municipalities are looking at short-term rentals. Somebody was kind enough to give me a bunch of newspaper clippings from Niagara Falls, New York, where they're trying to figure out the best way to have the best of both worlds, be able to accommodate owners of short-term rentals, users, and neighbors. Lancaster is looking at it. I think Cleveland is looking at it. And you all know that COVID has had an effect on this too. So we know that there's a lot of energy. We just got like 5 packets of information from different interested parties. And I can assure you, we're going to look at all of that. Probably won't be able to do this tonight, but I would like us to be done no later than 7 o'clock tonight, because most people on council also have other full-time or part-time jobs. So we're going to do our due diligence. You can contact any of us. We'll make sure that you know when the public hearing will occur, and I think we can get this done. Please don't be alarmed. Don't be alarmed. I think we can get this done, I hope. So we're going to start with, I believe, with Kathy Rosdick, our city planner, who has put extensive work into neighborhood revitalization. And there's some really interesting information that she has gathered about rental inspections. So even though a lot of people here might be from R1A residential neighborhoods, I want you to know that we as council members have to care about every neighborhood here. We have to care about the people who are renting and may not be in properties that are at the right, they aren't good rentals because somehow they've slipped through the cracks. So one of our council members is a tenant, and she is our voice for people who are renting day in and day out. So that's why we're looking at these 2 things together: rental inspections, how can we improve that, and then short-term rentals. So Kathy Rosdick, the floor is yours, so thank you.
Thank you, President Allen. And tonight, along with me is Andy Zimmerman, our Bureau Chief of Code Enforcement, and our Chief Zoning Officer, Jake Welsh, and then sitting not in the hot seat, as I told him, is Mike Gillespie. He is the code officer who is dedicated to the rental inspections and rental units. And we'll talk a little bit about what his role is. It's it is a new role for the city. It's not a new position, but we have a code officer who can be dedicated to what we would call special projects. And over the past, I don't know how long he's been here with us, 6 months maybe? October, Mike? Yep, October. He's sitting behind me. So he's just going to be the voice behind me. He has been dedicated to the rental and the rental program, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. I just want to make sure that I stick to the topics and get us through all this information. It is a lot of information to go through, and I appreciate everyone's time and patience as we go through it. But I'm going to read from the memo. It's not my typical style, but I just want to make sure I hit all the points and not miss anything. So I know some of you are very familiar with the landlord and rental registration program. Some may not be. So I wanted to make sure I covered the basics for those who are not as familiar and our new council members. The rental program was adopted in December of 2006. It requires owners of rental units, all rental units. At this point, it's not distinct between long-term or short-term, because that was something we did not have to do. In the city of Erie, they must be registered with the city and have the units inspected to ensure that they meet certain requirements of basic public health, safety, and welfare of citizens. The owners must register each unit with the city on an annual basis and pay a fee of $40 per unit. And the unit is inspected every 2 years. The registration fee is charged every year, but the unit is inspected every 2 years. Those fees increase to $65, and they continue to increase if the owner fails to show up for inspections or if re-inspections are required. Fee also increases if it's not paid within a certain time frame. If the unit passes inspection, a rental license is issued and is good for 2 years, subject to the annual registration payment being made. If a rental premise passes 2 consecutive inspections, then the premise is eligible to be inspected once every 4 years rather than every 2 years, and the annual registration fee is reduced to $30 per year. I believe that was a fairly recent amendment to the program within the past 3 years or so, 3 or 4 years. Exemptions for inspections do include rental units that are owner occupied. Those are typically someone who owns a duplex, they live in one, and they rent out the other. The other unit is registered, but it does not have to get inspected, exempt from inspection, as is if you rent to a family owner. Those are also exempt. But they all must be registered. So we do have them in our system, is essentially what that means. To date, we have been sort of looking at the data. We have over 9,000 properties, 9,048 properties, individual properties that are actively rented with a total of 20,539 units. So a property could have 2 or more units, and that's why you get the more than 9,000. Of those, 1,019 are Section 8 and inspected, not by HUD, that was a typo, it was by the Housing Authority. 2,120 are owner occupied, so therefore exempt from inspection. 1,103 are occupied by a family member, also exempt. 2,319 are not actively inspected, as they are currently under some sort of rehabilitation. So they have a permit, they're doing some construction work. 13,978 units are active in the inspection process. So they are they're registered, they're being occupied, and so that's what those numbers represent. We have, particularly during COVID, we had experienced a higher than usual amount of delinquency, people not paying the registration. The inspections were very difficult or not happening for a while, but registration fees were still expected. Because of that, and really this has happened mostly since March 2020, The delinquent accounts for registration is over $745,000. We take this very, very seriously. We certainly did have to wait for the moratorium on rentals to be lifted. I'm sorry, I'm not getting the word right. On evictions, excuse me, before we were able to get aggressive with collecting these accounts. As I mentioned, in order to do that, we have dedicated Mike Gillespie, our code enforcement officer, to deal with this problem and really any issue regarding rentals and the rental program. Yeah, you have in your packet the notices that we've been sending out, and you also have the agreement for repayment. So you just have that. I'm not going to refer to it, but you have it in case you want to look at it at some later time. Having one officer assigned to this program helps deal with these issues. It provides a higher level of oversight for problem properties and difficulties with landlords. Mike is becoming very familiar with the landlords, the tenants, and the program, which has improved collection and enforcement efforts. What we have done in order to start aggressively collecting on these accounts, and Mike's name is on the notice, so everyone has to contact him, to the top 20 past due accounts, we sent out notices on March 2022. They were given 30 days to bring their accounts to resolution. Just so you know, the top 20 delinquent property owners, so who owed the most, accounted for almost 20% of the total that was in arrears. Landlords were given an option to pay in full or set up a payment plan. Our policy is we do not reduce the amounts that they owe. If they want a reduction, they would have to come to City Council and justify why they don't have to pay the full fee. But other than that, they either have to pay the full fee or they have to set up a payment plan. And like I said, you have that information. Since those notices went out in March, we have collected over $64,000 in delinquent accounts. We consider that successful. Those are from the top 20. Other landlords who owe lesser are also paying, but we're focused on the top 20. 14 of the 20 property owners have responded and either paid in full or scheduled a payment plan. Mike has issued 224 citations for non-compliance or non-payment of those delinquent accounts. Just so you know, we can't send a notice to a property owner for 20 units. We have to send 20 notices for each unit, so that's where the numbers come up. So those citations have been sent out, and Mike will follow up and take the necessary next steps to litigate the matter in front of the DJ and try to get those accounts paid in full. Notices to the remaining delinquent account holders will all be sent out in May. We wanted to manage the collection in a way, and that's why we just focused on the top 20. We figured we'd get the most bang for our buck, but now that Mike is becoming more familiar with it, we're going to go ahead and notify everyone else who's delinquent. They get 30 days. And if they don't contact him in 30 days, then again, they're all going to be cited. So we are aggressively trying to collect these past due accounts. The reason I'm going over this is, one, we have talked a little bit about some of these challenges we had seen. So I wanted to make sure I brought the council up to date on what's happening with the rental program. Additionally, some of you have seen, and I don't have it for display, but I'd be happy to come to a council meeting and show you the property conditions survey that the city has undertaken over the past couple of years. We've done this through a GIS system, so it's all mapped. And what we've done is we've assessed each residential property based on its condition and ranked it 1 through 5. We have done this based on what a code enforcement officer would look at from a property maintenance standpoint. And this information we have used in a number of different ways. We're able to see, we know which ones are registered rentals, so we're able to discern which ones are being maintained, which ones are problem properties. We know which ones are vacant at the time that they're being reviewed. This is what we call a sidewalk survey, so we're taking it from the sidewalk. We've We've assessed over 70% of the city, and it's all in a GIS database, like I said. So it's really easy to utilize, and in many different ways. But one of them is the rental properties. When we did this survey, one of the concerns that we saw early on was this trend that rental properties, and I don't think anyone would argue this point, rental properties tend to not be as well maintained as owner-occupied. It's not 100% across the board, but in general, the higher percentage of properties that are rented are in poorer condition than owner-occupied. We were concerned with the number that we saw, which we would consider unsound. So the condition survey identifies those that are excellent, good, average, fair, excellent, good, average, poor, or unsound. The ones that are unsound for us are the most concerning. And we wanted to make sure that those stayed on our radar. We identified that 120 properties were unsound and were within the register. They were registered rentals. Since the time that this was discovered and we were able to dedicate resources like Mike Gillespie to this issue, 23 have been improved to a level of good or average. That doesn't mean that we had anything to do with that. The property owners could have been prompted themselves to improve the properties. 7 have been demolished, so these are not necessarily occupied, as you can see, but they are in the register. They're registered as rentals.
The 7 that were demolished, was that the taxpayers who did it, or were the landlords responsible for the demolish?
I couldn't get that information. It could have been a combination of blighted and the redevelopment authority
Okay.
would have demolished them, or it could have been the property owner themselves.
Okay, thank you. One more question. Is there any way for the tenants to be able to report the landlords? Have we been able to do anything? Because as a renter, I get asked all the time, where can I report, my crappy landlord who's not fixing anything? I've been here for 2 or 3 years. So can I get that information too when somebody gets
It's through the Citizens Response Center,
citizens?
through Moss,
Thank you.
and they can send their complaint through Moss, and then we get it.
And we get those often, daily.
And since Jasmine asked the question, this is something that I think would relate also to short-term rentals. When someone is a tenant or they're staying there as a short-term renter, is there like a certificate that says that something has been inspected? And if there is, or even if there isn't, can a tenant or a prospective renter find out if something has been inspected? This kind of gets to my kind of cheering for some type of searchable database where people would be able to find out if something had been inspected. But I had a great suggestion from somebody I talked to today who said, don't just think about databases, think about a dashboard that the city would have. The city of Austin is using and there's a cost involved to this, so I'm not going to say I'm going to pitch this particular company, although they have done work also in Niagara Falls, but they are, and this does relate to short-term rentals, they're doing a continual search of where those rentals are, making sure that they have been inspected and that they're paying the fees. So that kind of goes beyond this, but kind of getting back to my original question, are there things, is there a certificate when you go to rent someplace that says this has been inspected? And if you are a renter looking to see if something has been inspected, can you find out if it's been inspected? And if not, when the last time the inspection was? So how much of this information is public now? Do you know?
Right now, there's not a lot, but you approved new software for us.
Okay.
So in the very near future, you'll be able to see a lot more, and you will have a dashboard. All council members will have a dashboard that will see basically everything's going on in our office. Tenants right now, they can call our office and ask if a property's been approved or if it's conditional approval. Right, if it's an open, I'm not allowed to really get into details on it, but I can tell them if it's approved or not approved.
Okay.
So-
And I do, this is kind of deterring a little bit, but I just want to point out that we're getting there with data. We're getting there with being as transparent as possible. So if you look up here, this is our zoning map, and I just discovered that you and I and council, anybody can type in an address and find out what your zone is. It was so cool today to be able to go in and do that. That was not a function that we were able to do even just recently. So that's some of the patience that I'm kind of urging residents of the city of Erie to understand, that we now have people in place who know that not only do we need data, we need to make it accessible. So this is a very cool function.
Yeah,
So.
and you're going to get many more cool functions as we not only onboard CityWorks, which will be the management system that code enforcement uses, but Esri and the GIS capabilities that Esri has. So the dashboards that you're talking about, that's really going to be through the Esri programs and those applications. Once we have that up and running, what we'll do, whoever takes my place, will provide the data accessible to elected officials and administration. At some point, you will want to decide how much you make public facing, and you'll need to really have an understanding and policy in place, because it can get out of hand. You can provide maybe too much information where you really want, but to have elected officials have access at the touch of a button is going to be a huge improvement to the work that you do. Just to finalize the report on the vacant property or the rental property, 33 of the 120 rental properties that were unsound are vacant and have been declared blighted, so they're sitting there on our blighted property list, where there's about 120, 140 or so, maybe even more than that, that have been declared blighted.
That was still coming through the sidewalk observation, just...
They're declared blighted mostly through code enforcement action. They just happen to be unsound through the property condition survey. So what we did is we gave Mike the list of 120 and said, if they're not in some form of action under code enforcement, they need to get in some form of action. So that's either code enforcement citing the property owner, or if they've been cited, you hand it over to Mike Lavery. Mike Lavery is our demolition coordinator, and he gets it in front of the BBRC for declaration. And so that rolls right into 14 are vacant but not blighted, and so those are the ones that we said, okay, it's time to get them into the hands of Mike, and Mike can prepare them for BPRC and get them blighted. Couple of things that help spur the owner on to hopefully, if they can improve the property, and if they're unable or unwilling or absentee, then it allows the redevelopment authority to potentially take the property if necessary. 33 or 28% of the unsound are occupied but have received violation notices from the code officers. So the ones that are occupied, so those 33 and then the 10, so 43, those for us are the most concerning because of their poor condition or unsound condition. So we want to make sure we get them through the process as quickly as possible. And I think, Jasmine, this is probably the data points that you'd be most interested in, because these are the tenants who are living and perhaps don't know or are afraid to contact the code office. So these would be the ones that, again, we know all these properties, and so they are in some form of legal action. And again, just reiterating that Mike Gillespie does monitor this very, very closely. The reason I think this was a good program to start the conversation with tonight is because it does flow into short-term rentals. And as we transition into those, short-term rentals now, and Jake will go into more of the detail of that, short-term rentals they are considered rentals, and so they would be registered the same as a long-term rental now. as because of the slice of life decision, we will need to change the ordinance to identify short-term versus long-term. But just know that they will be a part of the registration program. They will be inspected, and so they will. I just want to make sure that that distinction was known, because it was I think it was unclear in previous discussions.
And I know that was important to Ed Brzezinski, is to distinguish that these are short-term rentals. Yes, you've asked for that. Can I ask, Jake, before you talk to us, and this kind of gets to some questions that Michael has raised, is the inspection fee adequate for short-term rentals? We actually have some short-term rental owners who think it should be higher. And when I looked at Austin, and short-term rental people don't get alarmed no matter what zone you're in. Austin's requirement for the initial short-term rental license was, I think, $649. So I'm just saying that's a big jump from $40 or $65. Do we need to have a higher fee for short-term rental inspections? And do we need to have additional requirements? Or maybe do we need to inspect additional things for regular rentals? And I'm going to give a couple of examples. I think, if I'm correct, that you didn't need a fire extinguisher for a regular rental. You didn't need to have carbon monoxide alert, or monitor wasn't on there. We actually had a recommendation, and this hasn't even gone to council yet, but this was thanks to the mayor's chief of staff, Renee, talking to Mike Nolan, who is the inspector for the police department. He suggested that short-term rentals be required to have external cameras. Interesting, I don't know, but so I wondered if you could tell me, do we need to make or to update that checklist for regular rentals? Should it have some additional things on there for short-term rentals? And do we need to examine the fee structure for short-term rentals? Michael, you had a very specific fee that you thought would help, because I know that there is concern, and I'm sure there's going to be even more concern tonight after you hear that there are regular property owners who aren't paying. How is the city going to make sure that this is enforced? So there could be an economic driver here that could help us and get the amount of what we need to make sure this is enforced correctly. So, Michael, it sounded like you had something.
No, I'm going to let him.
Okay, you're going to, okay, let him talk first, and then we'll go back.
I'll respond, and then we'll let Andy talk a little bit more about the history of where that fee was established, and I think there's been some litigation around that. And if Ed might be in Zoom space, I think he was going to zoom in, so I'm not going to do it justice to talk legalese. But as we all know, the fees have to we can't make money off these fees. It has to be enough to cover the cost of the inspections themselves and the administration of the program. So we could certainly look at, much like we did our cost of blight study, look at how much time it's actually taking inspectors. Of course, I think the BIU inspectors is a little different, but the administration and then the indirect costs. I mean, we could look at that. But I think it would absolutely have to be commensurate with how much time we're actually putting into it and compensating the inspectors and the registration clerks to make sure that it's covering those costs, but we can't make money. The distinguishing the short-term versus long-term, maybe it's not something that you want to do. You would have to determine, well, what is the detriment of short-term, what requires more inspection than a long-term rental. So if you would like us to look at the fees and the time it takes, I think that's something that's easily done. But then we'd have to have justification why short-term rental costs more than a long-term rental. Andy, is there more information about the history of the fees that I know you kind of went back and forth about that?
A little bit. Because these there really isn't a tenant, it's just a turnover, kind of like a motel. Rooming houses, we inspect once a year, not every 2 years. So, and if we do every year, which I'm leaning towards, then that fee should probably be around $80 to cover the inspection for the administration portion and the inspector's time a year.
So I will jump in. So one, in order to regulate this with the veracity that it needs to be done, it's going to take more manpower. And so because it's going to take more manpower, we're going to have to issue a fee. And so what I had circulated around council was that the annual fee be $500. And when the city hits 100 registrants, that would generate $50,000, and we will hire a full-time contractor to manage those 100. And then when the city gets to 200, that would be $100,000 in generation. They'll hire an additional person. And then that would be 2 persons who do full-time, whether they coordinate the inspections, and then like she's talking about the data point, one of the things is like I said, like you can, have a board, where they notify everyone every time it becomes active, when it's active, when it's not active, and these people do full-time, run this stuff down to make sure everybody's paying, everyone's is keeping up with their, that they're inspected and that they're operating, within the guidelines of the ordinance once it's drafted. And so it'd be nice to be the $40 outlet, but I don't think it's the reality of this particular situation.
And I would also like to, I don't think it's plugged in.
You're on. It's,
Okay, I can't
Yeah.
see it because the sun is blinding.
yeah.
Anyways, so I think that, to second what Liz was saying, is that I think that for the short-term rental leases, because of the tenants not being on long-term, we're going to have to inspect more often. At least maybe every 6 months might be why we need to inspect to make sure that everything is going how it should be. Just because I feel as though you're going to get so many people in and out of a building or a house, and you don't know what the damages are going to occur. I mean, people hate to admit that stuff does happen, but I think that that would also help keep the individual who we're going to hire busy and be able to adequately say that this is why we're going to charge the initial fee of whatever it is that you had mentioned. But I think that it should definitely be more than once a year.
And certainly we can look at that. What we haven't brought before you yet is an amendment to the rental program, so that'll be the next step. What you have before you is the zoning ordinance amendment that would permit them as a permitted use or a special exception. We were able to collect some data on what we believe is the most accurate data we have on how many short-term rentals we have, and the Visit Erie has access to what's called Air DNA, and they track the short-term rentals. So according to Visit Erie's information, there are 120 short-term rentals, so if you rent the entire place, in the entire county. We estimate that that equates to about 55 to 60 in the city of Erie. So, and that has increased over the past few years, but now they're seeing a decline in those numbers. So I don't know that we'll get to sufficient enough to hire one person.
There's already 170 Airbnbs operating in the city proper.
We have, so there's 2 different kinds. One is the separate individual and rent the entire place, or you just rent a room. There's renting a room, there are, according to this data, 39 in the entire county. But we can look at that. I mean, I don't think any of us are opposed to looking at inspecting more often. And you're right, we would want to ensure that that inspection fee covers the costs of the city to administer and to do the inspections. I just wanted to make sure that we were very clear that it's not going to be a revenue generator, and Ed Betza, Ed Betza would tell you.
We'll make enough money to be responsible.
And to be responsible, that's a good way to put it. So that sounds like we're naturally segueing into short-term rentals, and that's really where I think the meat of the discussion needs to center. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the pro on the short-term rental history within the city is Jake Welsh, our zoning officer, and he's just going to bring you, there's really been no changes to the ordinance that's been presented to you, and hopefully tonight we can clarify any misgivings or issues that you have. Just know that the second step will be an amendment to the rental registration program, which we'll bring to you once you decide whether or not to allow them with exceptions or not permit them at all. So Jake?
Thank you. So the information that's been provided, in essence, this report that provides some background on the development of the amendments to the zoning ordinance.
That is in your packet as
Yes.
well as the report. It's a couple of pages in past, excuse me, Jake, I just wanted to make sure they all knew. Sorry, it's sort of
So you
past all
have
the
two
rental.
things that
Yeah.
you'd be referring to, the staff report and then the draft ordinance.
So it's-
So these are the amendments that were prepared and recommended by the Planning Commission. And that was based on a lot of research that was done by our office, looking at
Yeah,
other
keep going.
communities, other model ordinances that they had developed, and not a lot of communities have, but we were able to kind of identify what the common themes were for zoning amendments, because that's one thing that I want to make sure that we're clear on is this is not a standalone ordinance. So it's different from the rental ordinance. The rental ordinance has its own authority. What this draft is are amendments to the city's current zoning ordinance. So this book that lists all of the uses that are permitted in the city of Erie and where they're permitted, this draft is going to add to this ordinance by listing the new use of a short-term rental, defining it. So we have to give it a definition, and essentially the definition is when you rent for a period less than 30 days. And then also identify what zoning districts that use would be permitted in. You know, every zoning district has its list of permitted uses, also has what are called special exception uses and conditional uses. And those are a little bit different as far as the approval process goes. Permitted use is permitted by right. Special exception requires approval by the zoning hearing board at a public hearing, and conditional requires approval by council at after a public hearing. So,
And Jake, that would
Yes.
be, for those of you who might have been following the proposed mini golf and the zip line, both of those things by Scott Enterprises required city council approval of that conditional use. We've given the mini golf approval. We haven't voted yet on conditional use for the zip line. And we've had other things come before council in my time on council where we had to approve conditional uses. So anyhow, just in case it was top of mind for anybody what conditional use is, so.
Could you, since I think Liz did a good job of conditional use, just real quick, special exception process, how you notify, who you notify, if you wouldn't mind clarifying that, Jake.
so the special exception process is, I guess, somewhat similar administratively to applying for a variance to the zoning hearing board. So the notification process is the same. It's going to be a scheduled public hearing. It's not the same as an appeal, as a variance appeal, because they're not requesting to deviate from the ordinance. What they're doing is they're demonstrating that they meet all of the conditions that are in the ordinance to allow that use to occur at the location they want it to occur at. The ordinance itself as I mentioned, we have to name the use, we have to define it, we have to indicate what districts it will be permitted in as by right or by special exception, which is what was recommended for the R1 and the R1A districts, so that you have an opportunity for public comment during a public hearing, and there's a list of conditions that the applicant has to demonstrate to the board that they are meeting and that they will meet. Those are the conditions that are on page 3 of the ordinance. The staff report kind of somewhat mirrors the ordinance in that it's kind of a description of each section of the amendments that are being recommended. The use, the definition, the list of districts, and then the list of conditions that all short-term rentals would be subject to, and in particular, additional conditions that any short-term rentals in the R1 and the R1A districts would be subject to. And that's in order to maintain a valid license to rent the property. And all of the rental, of course, licensing is already being done through the rental ordinance. So this makes perfect sense to dovetail right into the existing ordinance, not create a separate process. What this ordinance does not do is it does not establish things like fees or inspection schedules. This is simply to add the language to the zoning ordinance so we have the authority to dictate where they are and how they operate.
Jake, since I know there's a lot of people here interested in R1 and R1A, that was a great explanation. Thank you. That helps us, I think, to understand where we're going in terms of rental inspection and zoning amendments. Did you want to read what the special exceptions and what something in R1 or R1A would have to follow? And then again, kind of reiterate, because sometimes, what's that thing they say, you have to hear things like, I don't know, 3 times or 7 times, whatever, before you understand it, even for, I mean, I guess I would feel the same way, but just encapsulize what would have to happen for an R1 or R1A applicant for short-term rental. And then if you could just, those bullet points I think would be good to let everyone hear, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
Going through those.
Sure.
Michael, did you have a question? Okay. Sorry, Jake.
As far as the research that was done to look at where we would, what zoning districts we would put the use in, as far as permitted uses, I'll get into the special exception for R1 and R1A, but the rationale for identifying the districts where it would be listed as a permitted use is essentially the zoning districts that already permit some type of short-term lodging. So whether that's rooming houses or bed and breakfasts or hotels, you know, it makes perfect sense to allow a short-term rental in that same zoning district. So that's the rationale behind the districts that are listed as this is where they would be permitted. With regards to the special exception, again, we looked at the low-density neighborhoods, R1 and R1A. They deserve to have special consideration to make sure that we can mitigate as much as possible any negative impacts. There ideally shouldn't be any. You're going to see different cars with different license plates, but other than that, that property should function as a normal single-family dwelling, other than the term of occupancy of the occupant. That's kind of the idea behind the conditions that are set. So as far as the conditions that have been recommended, I'll list the conditions and the regulations that all short-term rentals have to abide by in order to maintain a license. If they violate any of these conditions, the license is revoked, which means they would not be able to rent the property. So all short-term rentals have to, as we've mentioned, apply for, receive, and maintain a valid residential rental license. The accommodation shall not exceed the number of occupants allowed within the applicable zoning district. And essentially what that means is when you have a dwelling unit, it's to be occupied by one family and one family only. There's a definition of family that includes either a family of related individuals, a nuclear family, and also a number of unrelated individuals that there is a limit on, which is currently 3 in the city of Erie, to occupy one residential dwelling unit. So, and those will still be applied, regardless of whether it's owner-occupied, a long-term rental, or a short-term rental.
I'm sorry, so that would be applied, now, I'm heading to Maine tomorrow. My mom's graduating college, we're all real excited. So we've got like 5 families crashing at a house in York, Maine. And so my family gets a bedroom, I get a bed, my kids are on the floor, and we're packing in the house. How do you expect the code how do you expect to actually monitor the single-family usage of houses for short-term rentals? I mean, I know I'm totally violating that in an R1 zone in a beautiful oceanfront house in Maine. How do you plan on regulating that?
Yeah, and there are absolutely rentals in other parts of the country where that's typical, that you'll have 3 or 4 families sharing a house. And the houses are typically large. They may still be set up as a single dwelling unit, but they're, 10 bathrooms and 20 bedrooms and things of that nature, which is by and large not the types of units that we have here in our R1 neighborhoods. And now, to answer your question, anytime that there's any kind of an occupancy limit or occupancy exceedance complaint, then absolutely we investigate it. And that's just as we would any other kind of zoning violation, whether it's an occupancy violation, whether it's a use violation.
So, so as you work with peers and people from other cities, you don't happen to know the person that works in York, Maine, do you?
No, I don't.
So I had sent something just out to council. You probably didn't get it, but one of the things that I was looking at putting in, the ordinance, I just drafted some things, ideas, and one of them was, that as far as occupancy, it would be like the same as that, but I put that, no more than, 2-person per bedroom or living space. Because like even if you go to rent a suite in a hotel, even though it's typically, 2, and then they put a couch over there that makes it 4, or in the side room. And so I thought something like that, just basic, so that, Chuck Nelson doesn't bring 7 families and put all of them in a bedroom, to be put into the language. So
The property maintenance code, the fire code, and the residential code cover overcrowding and
Right.
your occupancy limits.
Mm.
So
And you trust your ability to enforce that?
right,
we will get calls, so then we'll go out and investigate.
Yeah, it's complaint-based at that point. We're not going to go out every time the property's rented and make sure how many people. It's going to be the neighbors saying they have a party, there's too many people, they go out like it's done now. And I'm sure Maine has probably got provisions to allow large parties and or large groups to occupy very large beach houses. It's not beach, is it?
Yeah, it's
Okay, it's
beach.
beach,
It's
yeah.
gorgeous.
So, yeah, well, enjoy.
it's still going to be cold.
Yeah, it's still going to be cold.
Yeah, so when I did my overview of the map, and I know most of the controversy is in R1 and R2.
R1A.
R1 and R1A, is that what it was?
Correct.
Yes.
My bigger concern is actually the R1A, because as defined, that the houses are closer together, they're smaller lots, and, the closer you put people together, the more problems you're going to have. It's just that simple. And so that's what I see as the trouble spot, within, the overlap of the different areas, that Just, you're zoning, you're coding, you know, if you have any feedback on that particular.
Well, that's a good segue into what those additional conditions are for R1 and R1A. You know, one of them is right out of the gate, off-street parking. So there are properties in R1A that may not have an off-street parking space. Well, in order to be a short-term rental, they would be required to have one. So some properties will end up being disqualified because they will not be able to meet that condition. One of the other conditions is screening between that property and the adjacent properties. It really kind of meant to at least have some kind of privacy. We have similar requirements, screening requirements between commercial and residential properties. So this being kind of a quasi-commercial use, felt that was appropriate.
And Jake, I know we had one person who spoke at a council meeting who thought it should be very specific. The screening should be this high. It's my understanding, though, that because they would have to come and explain what their screening would be, there would be, I don't want to say wiggle room, but we aren't trying to get like really specific about how high that, or what type of plant you could put in there for the
It is.
screening? Okay.
It's, and the reason that it's not in any more detail in the amendment is because screening is
Covered. All right.
covered in the
Okay.
zoning ordinance. So if it says you need screening, screening is defined, the nuts and bolts of how high, if it's a planted screening, that has to be X feet high within a year. And so that's all already in the ordinance, which
Okay.
is good. We're not saying you need a special type of screen, but you have to comply with the other screening that other types of properties have to do as well.
So just as a point of clarification, regardless of the zoning, like, so this is it not currently permitted anywhere in the city? No.
It is. Right now, a short-term rental would be considered essentially a type of hotel.
Okay.
And there are certainly zoning districts where hotels are permitted, and there are residential units within those districts that if somebody was renting them on a short-term basis, we would kind of have to say that the principal use of that space would be as a hotel, as a short-term rental.
So as of right now, all of our use of short-term rentals is in the concept of hotel, bed and breakfast.
Generally
housing,
speaking,
boarding
yeah,
house.
bed and breakfasts are very specific uses as far as regulated by the state, where you literally do have to serve breakfast and have a license to do so.
And there was a bit of, I recall when the bed and breakfasts were approved, I mean, that created some controversy, but I can't remember how many years ago that was, and then, right? But Jake, you weren't here at the city, I don't think, at that time.
No,
Yeah.
and the bed and breakfasts, have their own specific regulations, just as the same as rooming houses as far as parking requirements, screening requirements. Obviously, they're all still subject to the building code, the fire code, and all of those things as far as occupancy.
Madam President, may I play devil's advocate for a minute? I just called my wife and I'm going to open up an Airbnb, but I'm not going to apply. What are you going to do to me?
Well, if it's not licensed and it's not in the right location,
Well, I mean,
then it's going to be considered a violation of the zoning ordinance, and it's going to fall under the existing provisions,
what's going to happen, Jake?
which, once the property owner is notified and they fail to comply, then a citation would be issued, and they would be subject to fines up to $500 a day, and that would be levied by the district judge.
So,
Another,
And then we'd cite you for not registering as a rental, just by the way. I'm pretty sure
There's
we're
a
gonna get-
lot of confession going on
Well,
here
and the
tonight.
rental, and,
Anybody else doing anything?
having
Yeah,
that, you'd almost be subject to two
Yes.
separate violations. You'd be violating the rental ordinance, and you'd be violating the zoning ordinance. And I think both of which have the same penalties as far
that's
as,
why I asked the question.
Right, so
Clarification.
if, So one of the reasons why I think that this will be easier than some may purport it to be is that if you want to do business as an Airbnb, you have to list it, or a short-term rental, you have to list it somewhere. And so, you know, I got my information directly from Airbnb, you know, which has some 170 listed within the city proper, and outlined exactly where everyone is, where it's at, with the, you have to, maybe not the exact address, but every street, every house by the GIS system, so that it's easy for somebody to identify these places who are going to be operating within the short-term rental arena. So.
I see that Ed Betts, our city solicitor. I just want to make sure, Ed, did you have any comments that you wanted to make? You turned your video on, so I wanted to give you a second.
I just wanted to give you a chance to see me, but no, I think everything that's been covered is accurate.
So says Mr. Betts. Thank you, Ed.
So I have a question. With a screen planting strip, so fencing, screen, what if the HOA already doesn't allow that? And we require it to be a short-term rental, and the HOA already doesn't allow it in some of them here. Does that prevent Airbnbs in that particular neighborhood?
It would. If an HOA prohibits that use, that would supersede, well, any of the requirements of the HOA. Now, for instance, if an HOA prohibits a short-term rental from being in that neighborhood, then that supersedes the city's ordinance because it's more restrictive. An HOA can't be less restrictive than the city's ordinances, but it can be more restrictive.
So with the screen planting and the fencing, if there's an HOA that already has that restriction and we require it for a short-term rental, they'll immediately be in violation, like as soon as we open this up?
I guess it would depend on the specific circumstance as far as what restrictions there would be in place for hedges and or fences in a specific neighborhood with an HOA. I mean, that's difficult to answer in general.
While we have everyone here, you know, one of the big questions is where? And I think that, you know, we should take a few minutes to, among council, with your permission, about where do we want it? Because that's the biggest.
But before we get there, can we just finish those? Because
Yeah.
I do want people to hear the proposed.
Oh, yeah.
I think we stopped at the screen planting, that kind of, so Jake, there's just
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more things, so if you could just go over those, okay? That would be helpful.
Yes. Outdoor lighting, any outdoor lighting that's installed has to be designed to prevent glare. That sounds like a general statement, but essentially that means the lighting should be hooded so that it's not blaring out to the neighboring properties. No outdoor loudspeakers or sound systems. You know, we don't want these properties to turn into party houses, so you have to put some regulations in place regulating kind of the outdoor use of the property. That's hence the screening, the lighting, the outdoor loudspeakers. One thing that kind of speaks to the occupancy standards, all operators have to maintain a guest logbook that includes the names of the guests and the dates of stay. So if there are any allegations that they're over occupancy, we can refer to the logbook, and that should give us a sense of who stayed there, single families, unrelated folks, things of that nature. And that log has to be available for inspection at any time the city requests it.
What happens if they don't fill in the logbook, or are we gonna, like, when we do our inspection, check the logbook? Like, how often is the logbook gonna be looked at or reviewed?
I would think the biggest, I mean, obviously, if we decide that we're gonna do periodic inspections or request those logbooks periodically, and they're not provided, that's a violation of the conditions, and their license would be revoked.
Okay, thank you.
What about checking, so they provide you for the logbook, and checking while, you know, I'm going to have ABC staying here at this time, being able to check while those people are staying there, that the reported people who are going to stay there, you're checking to see if this is actually the people that are in attendance, or, you know what I mean? If you say there's going to be 5 people here or whatever, and you have access to that, and you go and there's 30 in there, I mean, that's, wow, it's supposed to be 5.
So I need a clarification if I could. You said that if the homeowners association made a rule that in Frontier you cannot have Airbnbs, or in Glenwood or Glenwood Hills you can't have Airbnbs, then it becomes a litigation between the people who own the house and the HOF, and people are not even involved in it.
That's
Is that right?
correct.
Edward, is that
And
right?
that would be correct. They could be more restrictive, and then they would have to follow that. Ed, is there anything else to add, or you could tell me I'm wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. The HOA can make its own rule.
So we have a
You've
lot
got
of
to
people
follow
upset,
those
and we have
rules.
nothing to say about it, actually, right? Is that what we're saying? In
Well,
those, in our
that's-
areas,
If the HOA decides to not permit them,
right?
yeah, that's the property owner's,
There'd be
you know,
no
responsibility.
grandfathering, the ones that are there already?
And I don't think, under an HOA agreement, I don't think there is a grandfathering clause, but I could be wrong, Ed.
You're correct.
Yeah.
An easier way to think of it is imagine a swimming pool. A lot of HOAs prohibit swimming pools. The city of Erie does not. So if I put a swimming pool in, I'm going to be okay with the city, but I'm not going to be okay with my HOA. I'm going to have to take it out.
Lawyers are gonna have fun, huh? To get us off the nerve.
I could, and it's going to be complaint-based.
2 more conditions here that
Two more.
that Jake is going to read.
All advertisements for an approved STR must clearly display the license number issued for that unit. Failure to do so is grounds for cancellation of the license. And then lastly, the board may attach any reasonable conditions necessary to address public health, safety, and welfare concerns. So the board being either the zoning hearing board or council, who has the right to apply additional conditions to any approval that are considered reasonable.
I have a question. So, and I know we keep reverting back from the city's standpoint that the existing manpower and code enforcement and apparatus is going to do this work. And so we know it's going to take additional manpower. And so do you think this would fall under zoning or code or as a new office under planning?
I think I could answer that. I don't believe that this, I mean, this will increase, this will require additional inspections, but as we mentioned before, where there's over 9,000 rentals now, and we'll have to, I'm going to get your information, Mr. Keys, where you're getting your data, but we believe there's between 55 and maybe 170 that are already being inspected now if they're following the rules. So I don't know that there's going to be a significant increase, but I do believe there is, you've made a valid request to look at the manpower that's being used now to monitor the 9,000 that we have, and, well, actually, it's 13,000 units. So it's a lot. But to take a new look at, is that actually covering the costs, and doing it from that? Because I believe it's it's the larger number, the rentals, whether they're long-term or short-term, that
Right.
needs to be
So-
looked at.
So this is what I envision. So if we are going to permit it, I want people dedicated to making sure it happens the way the ordinance says it's done, that people, so that we can have robust, not two 2 times a year they know you're coming. You know what I mean? We need 2 people who to stay on top of these. We need people to know, to track when they're being used, when they're not being used, and then, the ability to, if there is a complaint, the ability to respond. Because if they call the city on the weekend, the city's gonna get it on Monday, probably afternoon. No offense, guys, but anyways.
No, they get it,
But
they get it
no,
first
because
thing
the
in the
city's
morning.
not open on the weekend. And so in order to, so we need people dedicated to do this work if we are gonna be permitted. And so I just want, the 3 of you should possibly get together and try and figure how we can do that and understand about the long-term rentals, but,
And Michael, I will follow up with those cities that I know are using that service, again, for which there is a charge that is constantly mining, because we always think of Airbnb, but the reason we call it short-term rental is because there are other platforms. I mean, there's Craigslist, there's VBR, whatever.
There's 10,000 is the data point, 10,000 companies
Yeah.
that administer
Right.
short-term rentals.
But
so.
I obviously had
I only have 3 apps on my
salesperson
phone.
pitch this to me. Hey, we can do this, and Austin's using it, and in Niagara Falls, it might be a township at Niagara Falls has used it, and I thought he said Lancaster was going to use it. So I will follow up with them instead of having the sales pitch and just get an idea of how much they're paying for that. That's where they're, and if you look at the Austin link that I sent, you can complain 24/7 if you think that something is not being done. I mean, that doesn't mean that a code officer is going to go outright then, but I'll find out more information about that. It was intriguing to me because of the ability to do that dashboard and say, hey, here's what's going on. But I don't know. I only talked to the person earlier today. I read a little bit about Niagara Falls, but I'll do some more work on that to find out about that.
And,
I'm sorry. May I-
go ahead.
All kidding aside, with a real estate background, it's a known fact that short-term rentals are taken care of much better than long-term rentals. To be on an Airbnb situation, you're not going to be able to list your property or have your property be advertised, or could be advertised, but it won't be rented because people are going to read the feedback you're going to get from the people that were there before. So they have to be done. The question is not, are these Airbnbs nice or not nice? The question is where they belong. And that's going to be a sticky wicket. And I think from what the Esquire said, it's not going to be our problem. It's going to be the homeowners association in each of the areas that either do want them or don't want them, and then it's going to be litigious. It's going to be the
You
attorneys are going to make money.
You certainly have a number of options before you, as you move forward with looking at this ordinance. You could decide that the ordinance, the zoning amendment meets all your intent and you support it, and therefore you're allowing short-term rentals in R1 and R1A with special exception. You could decide you don't want to do that, and you do not permit them in R1 and R1A. So you do have those options. But we would then move forward and just add the definition of short-term rentals and permit them where other short-term lodging is already permitted. So there are options before you. What we wanted to do, and the reason you have an amendment that's sort of a compromise of both, is because you had sent this to the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission spent many, many months kind of doing this kind of discussion, which is what your Planning Commission's designed to do, is to kind of do the heavy lifting for you and provide you with a recommendation. But you do not have to take the amendment as it's read today. You do have the choice to pull those. I'd also like to add to the discussion about the fees. Mr. Keys, that rhymes, I kind of like that. I think you're right. I think we need to look at the manpower it takes, or the woman power it takes to get this job done, make sure our fees are covered, because it shouldn't be subsidized by taxpayers to do this work. But what I'll bring back to you, though, is to look at the holistic approach of the rental program, because what was the most concerning numbers that I shared with you wasn't short-term rentals. It was the unsound rentals. And so I think there is a policy problem with the policy as it stands to date. And it's the 9,000 properties that are already out there that concern me the most, to make sure that the health and welfare of our citizens are maintained. And so the only way we can do that is to make sure that we have sufficient resources in our enforcement office to go after the problem properties.
Oh, absolutely. And so, in fact, I'll suggest, why don't you create a task force and involve City Council on the unsound properties, and maybe we can assist in some kind of way, either from a landlord-tenant mediation or something else that might help move these in the right direction, and so that people aren't living in places where people should not live.
Yes, it's a great idea, and the property condition survey dashboard is a great place for us to start. And I would assume that would be housed with the Committee for Housing and Neighborhoods, perhaps? Mr. Witherspoon's chair. That was Mr. Key's idea.
I did want to say, I know Michael, I think, wanted to get a sense of where we're at, and I'm not trying to push people off, but we got a lot of information, not only internally. We did get handouts from people who have short-term rentals. We also got something from an attorney who I think might be speaking from Glenwood. We got this handed, we just got this as we walked in, so I haven't had a chance to read this. I don't know that anybody else has had a chance to read that also. I think everybody in the audience might not agree. I think we did do a lot of communicating tonight, and I would like Kathy or Jake just to real quickly go over vacant property. Chuck is going to be going on vacations for his grandmother's graduation. My mom. Your mom's graduation. Okay, from college. That's cool. And I had hoped that we could wrap this up by 7. I want to reassure people, you will have a voice, you will have a chance. We will keep you updated as we work this through. You'll be able to talk at the public hearing. Anybody has more information to send to us or comments after what you heard tonight, we will listen to them. Anyhow, Kathy, if you just can really, if you don't mind, just talking about vacant property also.
Sure.
Madam President, before she can say, I just want to say we received a lot of data this evening, and it seems to me that if you're considering 1 or 2 new people to oversee this, that ain't going to work. It looks to me that you need to create another department or hire additional folks. We need to look into that. I love the 6 months review. Well, they know we come in every 6 months. Legally, can we do a drop-by unannounced? Okay? Because if I know you coming, my place is going to be right.
Hey, did you,
Okay?
so
Yeah.
email that I sent, I did address that. And so I believe it was like, that they'll be provided for inspection, within 4 hours from whoever the person is, and so that if there is a party or something going on, not saying you'll catch them red-handed or not, but you can, whoever the point person is, say, hey, within 4 hours, I would like to inspect the place, da-da-da-da, we have a concern, da-da-da, and I think it would be legal, but we'd have to defer to Mr. Esquire.
Well, my question is, do I have to tell him or her or whoever owns it? I can't drop by? Yeah,
Oh,
I'm
you can
coming
drop by.
to the party.
Yeah, so you probably will not gain entrance through the front door, but you definitely can
Ed.
go observe the property.
Mr. Betza had something to say.
Yes, sir.
You're on, Esquire.
You can drive by.
Yeah.
You can also schedule appointments or inspections.
So just a point of clarification too, I've not come before you tonight to ask for more staff or additional departments. I don't want anyone leaving here thinking that on my way out the door, I'm just going to, but I will, yeah. Well, I will bring you the report that what we believe it will
Andy's
take to
been working
manage
7 days a
this.
week. He's 24 years old. You
I know, right? But you, as you see, I will bring you a very detailed assessment of what I think it would take, and I'll make sure you have that. That will also need to come along with the amendment, the changes to the rental registration. So you will see another amendment coming before you. That's in addition to the zoning. So that's where we'll do that, sorry.
And we can also do a work back, though, or a timeline to say, keeping in mind that your time you'll be leaving at the end of May, but we can do a work back or a timeline to say, we would like to do this by this, and this by this, and this is when the public hearing is going to be. And I think I already said that the public hearing will not be on the night of a council meeting, because we don't want you to have to stand in line for hours, and, we want to make sure everybody is heard. So we'll unbundle that from a regular city council meeting so that everybody has a chance to speak. But we'll work on a timeline to figure out when we can, so we aren't trying to put this off, but we're trying to do it right. But so what about vacant properties? Is that something on a near horizon or a farther horizon for us, do you think?
We can certainly go through the timeline that you feel most comfortable with. And what I've provided for you tonight is just a high-level overview of vacant property registration ordinances. So similar to rental registration, there are VPROs is what we call them. And this is a permitted exercise that cities across the United States have enacted for certain reasons. And it's essentially, there's a number of benefits to a VPRO. Some communities that are growing, and they want to encourage property speculators not to sit on properties. In areas that may be in decline, there's really it's meant to try to address problem properties and blight early on. And it's essentially an annual requirement that all vacant properties, so this is not just residential, landlord and rental is just residential, this would include all vacant, industrial and commercial, the owners are required to register them with the city, and there is a fee. That fee is significant enough to cover the cost of a very detailed inspection by the fire inspector, by the code officer. And then those properties are re-inspected every year. Usually, the longer they sit vacant, the fee increases because, and as you know, many of the properties, because of the impact to the neighborhood for that vacant property to remain there. They're usually subject to criminal activity, a lot of them. In some areas, and we've gotten really disturbing reports from the County Redevelopment Authority, who has purchased some of these brownfield sites, what has been being stored in these vacant industrial buildings. We just blighted a property 2 weeks ago on Parade Street. That is essentially a brownfield. And the ability for inspectors to get into a property and perhaps early on notice that there's a hole in the roof that needs to be fixed and repaired, they have a chance of potentially saving that building. But they also, it is also meant to incentivize property owners to do something with those vacant properties. So it's different, it feels similar to the landlord registration, but it is different, and it's meant to address specifically issues with vacant and abandoned properties. It also has the benefit of giving the city a list of responsible property owners. So now we have, if they're registering. If they're registering, we know who to contact if something happens with those buildings. Darren Hart did pull some information together for us. And 15 of we were looking at fires in vacant structures, and 15 of the 100, I believe there's 150, so 10% of all fires structure fires were in vacant buildings. So there's a cost to the city for these vacant buildings to remain. There's a cost for fire support, there's a cost to the police department, and there's a cost to code enforcement, but there's also a cost to the people who have to live by them. So I think this is a valuable tool for a city the size of Erie dealing with the blight. And I would be, happy to put together an amendment for you to review. There are companies, much like what you were referring to, that scan. United States Postal Service, they have ways of scanning where those vacant properties exist, because for us, it's through observation of them being vacant, but they have a way of scanning for those, and that can help us actually prop up a registration program pretty quickly and efficiently. There are built-in exemptions for people who they live out of town, or they fly to Florida for the winter, and they leave their property vacant. That would be an exemption. Ones that are actively being up for sale but having challenges, those can be exemptions. So there's a way to build in exemptions for properties that a family might own for their extended family members to come and stay rent-free on occasion. We can build in exemptions like that. It's really meant to deal with the problem properties. And I know, Chuck, you have an interest in this topic and came to me. I had an interest as well, and said, okay, let me work on some other issues that we're trying to address, and then we'll look at vacant properties.
Kathy,
So.
that is great, and I know we're getting ready to wrap up, but I was looking at my own notes here, and I think this kind of also would tie into vacant property and short-term rental and regular rentals, because we know that one of the concerns that has been raised is, what about absentee landlords or corporations coming in and buying up property to rent to regular people? Nels has heard from a tenant who is, I think she finally moved out because it was all full of mold. Not yet, okay. So is there anything over the span of all these three different issues that we have to deal with in terms of absentee property owners? Do we know, for instance, about the ones who aren't paying? And I guess I would have to even say, how do we define absentee? Because you could live in Erie and I guess sort of be an absentee landowner, right? Or do we have to think about that? Because that is a concern of people who are thinking about short-term rentals. Somebody's going to come in from out of town and buy something and be right. So can we don't have to talk about that tonight, but I just want to let everybody know that I have been listening to the concerns that have been raised in terms of short-term rentals, but also with the people who have. I've gotten probably 3 calls in recent months from people who are renting from absentee landlords and feeling totally frustrated.
I can speak to the vacant property. One of the requirements is, because there are inspections, someone has to be available to let the inspectors in. So you have to have someone local as a responsible party for particularly with the vacant. And it's similar to rental, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that they would have to reside within Erie County.
Either a property manager or someone who's responsible, so you can send them notices and they can accept citations and things like that.
I believe it was the city of Atlanta just strengthened, that the one you sent out? Jasmine sent out, where they're now requiring Airbnb persons to be residents of Atlanta and then only operate more than 2. So they're kind of going away from the corporate takeover model into, the small person, strengthening their own financials by, maybe, renting their summer home while they're gone or something like that. And so I think that that and the other one about limiting the total number of Airbnbs to less than 1% or in a geographic area or less than 5, whatever it would be, where things where, where we can look at. And I'm personally more fond of the model where the local people are actually being able to get into the market and take advantage of this new system as opposed to the corporations, because I had a conversation with some of the people in the audience, and one of the things I told them was we need some self-responsibility in this too. One, don't sell your single-family home to a corporation. That's one thing we cannot do. That's to cut the problem right up front, and I know it's tempting when, corporations are coming with cash offers and different things, but if you live in a single-family area and you want to maintain it that way, sell your house to a family, and we cut out half the opportunities for these other entities to even take a foothold.
I did want to mention that Darren Hart is on the call, and I don't know, Darren, if you wanted to say anything. I saw that you turned your
Kathy,
video
can
on.
you just tell everybody who Darren is? so
Darren
that-
Hart is our fire inspector.
Fire Inspector Darren Hart.
Hello, I just wanted to weigh in on the on vacant properties. They are quite a danger, not only for firefighters, but for, we've had a lot of instances where people are squatting in vacant properties. Lately, we've had a couple instances where they've been heating their houses with fire pits and propane grill. So some of the activity that goes on in these vacants is very dangerous. And as Kathy referred, we did have 15 fires last year. About 15% of our fires were actually in vacants. So any way we can get these vacants cleaned up, secured, most importantly secured, that's what we want to do.
I've been kind of cataloging them in my neighborhood, the West Bayfront, and asking some of the neighborhood associations what some of the vacant problems are. So if anyone on council is curious about that, you go with Radmi and I can point out, which houses we're talking about that have been vacant.
Anything else? Thank you to everybody who came tonight. Thank you to those who left early, who may have wanted to go out and catch the nice sun, even though it's cold. Thank you, council, for taking time. We'll all be together next Wednesday morning, and then we'll figure out a timeline, a deadline, a work back on these 3 different things that we've talked about. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.